talk today a little bit about families. I mean, I am who I am in part because of the family that I grew up in. Mom, dad, younger brother, very annoying younger brother. Eventually, stepmom, stepdad, and each of their lives affected who I am in very tangible ways. And we read that even Timothy got his rich faith from his mother and his grandmother. Now, each of the members of the family Madrigal in the movie Encanto, which we have been peeking into with various characters, intrinsically influence their village and each other as well. So we're going to take a look at the gifts the whole family brings, and Ryan, bless his heart, figured out how to close caption it for us. So we'll all be able to follow along. So let's take a look at this family. Mirabel didn't get one. Can you imagine being the one person in that family to not have a gift? In this particular family, the acquisition of a gift was so important that to be the one child who doesn't get one is huge. But as we learn throughout the film, each person is so much more than their particular gift. And so we come to life lesson number 4. You shouldn't let yourself be defined by one thing. And you know the problem. You're so defined by your work that your family rarely gets to see you, or you're so wrapped up in being the perfect son or daughter that your parents' needs supersede your own. But your career doesn't define you. Your relationships don't define you. Even your talents don't define you. As Ken told us earlier, we human beings are so complex that if you think your intelligence or your beauty or your sense of humor is the only thing special about you, you're flat out wrong. There are so many interesting things about you. Even Timothy, who evidently had this amazing leadership gift bestowed upon him with the laying on of hands, had to be reminded that it wasn't enough just to have that one gift or even a heritage to fall back on. He needed to take responsibility for keeping his gift of leadership ablaze while at the same time dealing with all the pain and suffering and unknowing that comes when leading within a church community. And the letter tells Timothy that while his identity is grounded in his heritage, that alone doesn't define him. It's how he lives into his faith, how he rediscovers his faith, how he redefines who he is in that faith that forms him into the kind of leader that he is capable of being. So today we're going to be excavating how our beliefs about God, about church, about ourselves are meaningfully connected and rooted in our individual and our shared heritages. Carl Jacobson tells about a time just prior to the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, when he was a college exchange student studying in Shanghai. Carl and his fellow exchange students from around the world lived in a dormitory on campus set aside for foreign students. So the students from the US and Europe and Asia and Australia were there to study the language of China, its history and its literature. But there was also a second group of foreign exchange students from Africa and the Arabian Peninsula who were there to study math and science in English because of arrangements made by their governments. Now, since these students weren't learning the official language, they were a bit isolated from the other students on campus. Now, as is common in many dorm rooms, just inside the entrance was an erasable announcement board for sharing information of interest to students. As Carl's days in Shanghai wore down and the U.S. drew closer to war, he noticed that more and more frequently students would walk into the dorm and find that chalkboard filled with Arabic script. And one English word was often prominent, the word bush. So things were sort of tense on campus. To make matters worse, Carl's Zambian pal, Enoch, unwittingly made him a potential target of violence by falsely announcing that Carl was in the U.S. Marines. Now, Enoch's intention was to protect Carl, but what he said was, if they think you're an American soldier, Carl, they will not dare to touch you for fear. But Carl actually knew this probably would put a mark on him instead. So then came the moment on a quiet New Year's Eve when Carl was up late studying alone in his room. He heard a tenuous knock on his door. Without much thought, he opened the door to find himself staring in the eyes of a very serious student from Yemen. And the student was fully dressed in the formal attire of his culture, including a very sharp ceremonial dagger hanging at his side. Well, Carl did exactly what you and I would do if we were in that same situation at that tense time. He invited his fellow student into his room. And the student entered, shut the door behind him, actually reached up to pull the wire from the two-way speaker that was going to the front desk that was attached to the door. And Carl recounts, I didn't quite know what to expect in that moment, and I really didn't know what to do. So I asked, how can I help you? And the student visitor began to talk passionately about his family, his wife, his 4 sons who are back in Yemen. And he described the more than 3 years of painful separation they had endured while he pursued his degree in mathematics. This desperate father had come to Carl, hoping that Carl would be willing to write a letter to the president of the university in Mandarin because he felt that a letter in the official language of China would be more respectful and more likely to succeed. So Carl spent the next couple of hours doing just that. The student would tell him in broken English what he wanted to be said, and Carl did his best to translate that into Mandarin. And after they had finished, Carl said, why did you come to me? There are a whole lot of students who are much better at this language than I am, who have been here longer and would do a better job. Why did you pick me? And the students answer, I came to you because I knew you were a Christian, and I knew that a Christian would help me. Ever since then, Carl says, I've wanted to be that kind of Christian, the kind that creates expectations. Now, to be clear, I share this not because I'm the hero of the story. I'm not. The point is that the testimony of Jesus, embodied however feebly in us, is filled with potential. The potential, to be sure, of unsafety and suffering, but also the potential for faith and love to break forth from us. And that got me to thinking, what does the church look like when faith and love break forth? Perhaps we see our children in Sunday school and music camps thrive because they know the security of a love that provides for their needs. Or we help those struggling on the margins to find some sense of stability because of a love that works tirelessly to try to find ways to distribute food and goods that would ordinarily end up in our landfills. Or perhaps it's the potential for families to find a safe place to find support because of a love that welcomes them to the fellowship and fun of a messy church or an inclusive faith community. Or Fred and I went down to the Tucson Pride Festival yesterday just to let people know that the church loves them despite of harm that might have been done to them in the past. You see, when we refuse to allow ourselves to be defined by any one thing, whether that's a gift or a talent or an understanding or a philosophy or even an expression of church, then we open up that kind of potential in our own lives as well. Now, in addition to that potential, I want us also just to be able to admit that there are times when the Christian faith can be incredibly discouraging. That might sound like the ultimate oxymoron, but it really is true. And the fact of the matter is, if we're facing or feeling that kind of discouragement, we are not the first Christians to go through that. Because our scripture lesson for today conveys that Timothy and the believers in his care were discouraged, despite all of their amazing gifts and potential. You see, it would seem that they found themselves in an environment in which it was increasingly difficult to live a Christian life. Does it sound familiar? And when we read between the lines and we try to think contextually, we get this sense that the Christian community is actually waning in confidence about the faith, perhaps even feeling embarrassed about their faith. Perhaps they felt embarrassed because they found themselves feeling discouraged from going against the grain all the time. Maybe you remember a time in your life when that zeal and enthusiasm came when you made your first active commitment to follow Jesus, or some other commitment that you made to actively support a particular cause for the greater common good. Well, taking up a countercultural lifestyle can really be energizing, especially at first. But after months and years of potentially swimming upstream, that can get rather exhausting. So perhaps Timothy and the believers in Ephesus were feeling the pressures of the sacrifices and ostracism and opposition that can be a part of what it means to be a Christian. It would also seem that Timothy and his band of struggling believers he was serving were feeling embarrassed because they were losing out to some competitors preaching a different gospel. Have you ever thought that your version of what it means to be Christian is different from what you're hearing others saying it means to be a Christian? Now, we don't know what all those imposters stood for in the letter to Timothy, but we do know that they imposed some harsh demands on those who bought into their spiel while indulging their own pleasures to their heart's delight. They wormed their way into congregations by creating conflict within the established leaders, and then they used that influence that they gained to milk the people for money. Some things, I think, never change. But it would seem that Timothy and his flock felt embarrassed by the gospel because these imposters were being extraordinarily successful at gaining converts while they were struggling to survive. But Timothy was giving us advice that might help us a little bit as we struggle with our own discouragement post-pandemic, when we're missing so many of our friends due to relocation, changes of interests, fear of health protocols, even death. Timothy was reminded that God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. In a very real sense, discouraged believers of all times and places are reminded that we're not called to succeed, but rather to keep the faith. In these times, we also have the lessons that Jesus taught his disciples. I mean, the Gospels indicate, right, that Jesus' followers had plenty of doubts. They would come to him asking for more faith to be able to live up to the challenging demands of Christian discipleship. And he would always tell them, you don't need more faith. You just need a conviction and an understanding that the very smallest degree of faith is enough. Faith, you see, is not this matter of performing spectacular one-off feats. It's about continuing to speak the gospel and to live it out every day, regardless of the outcome. So when we struggle with discouragement in our own day and time, we can remember that it's not our perceived success, but rather our perseverance that demonstrates God's powerful and loving presence among us. And then I think if we just share what that looks like in our lives, we will see more and more people connect to us on some level as we simply share our stories. Because when we share the love of God by interacting with people, whether it's between the tracks or by making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for Casa Maria, or by hanging out with the youth on a Sunday evening, or providing a meal for a bereaved family and friends, we bring the unique flavor of our own interests, combined with the mission of Desert Skies, to a world that desperately needs what we have to offer. As we learned from the family madrigal in Encanto, this is our home. We've got every generation, so full of music, a rhythm of its own design. This is my family, a perfect constellation. So many stars, and everyone gets to shine. Amen.